Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from in the world today. Really pleased to see you here. Thank you for joining us for this session where we'll be talking all about unlocking the power of GenAI and the best use cases for AI, how you prepare your data platform for AI. Joined by the brilliant Dr. Tom Wilson today. I've got a few intros just to take you through. So you've got me, Sophie, moderating. I'm a client partnerships manager here at Cynozure. I'll be in the chat moderating today. I'll take you through a little bit of housekeeping in a mo. Great to see so many of you here. And we've got the brilliant Dr. Tom Wilson, who is a solution architect here at Cynozure, leading on our data science, analytics and AI projects for various clients. Tom, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, I will do. Hi, everyone. I think some of you have probably met me before in various guises, but if I haven't met you before, thank you so much for coming and for listening into this talk. As Sophie said, I'm Tom. I'm a solution architect, been working for Cynozure for just almost, what, just over 2.5 years now. I joined actually from the client side, so I used to work for one of the clients that that Cynozure was in with, as a data scientist. So they were called LW Theatres, a big West End theatre company. And prior to getting into the working world, I got my doctorate from studying solar cell engineering, basically. So that's where I kind of got into my analytics and data science space. But yeah, lovely to see you all. Hopefully you'll all be interested in the topic we're talking about today.
Brilliant. We've got lots to take you through. Just before we jump in, we've got some small housekeeping bits to take, just to explain to you. If you could just forward it on for me one slide, please, Tom.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. So obviously everyone very, very used to Teams at this point, but do let us know where you're dialing in from in the chat. Love to see where everybody is today. There is a Q&A function as well, and we will have time at the end to go through various questions and answers. Tom has kindly agreed to do and ask me anything. So pop the questions in and we'll get through as many as we possibly can at the end of the session. And look forward to hearing what you've got to say, what your thoughts are. Okay, so lots of you may have come to a Cynozure webinar or event similar to this in the past, and if so, it's great to see you back again. If this is your first session with Cynozure, thank you for joining. For context, we're a data and analytics strategy consultancy, and we support various clients across their full data journey. So whether that's figuring out the what's and whys and the strategy around data and AI, all the way through to implementation. So things like data management, AI and analytics, what their data culture should look like, and what a platform should look like. Obviously, that's quite a lot of breadth within data. And today specifically, we're looking at use cases for generative AI and how organizations can get their data platform ready to get the most value from those use cases. So we'll focus in on that today. We bring experience from all sorts of organizations into this topic. So we work cross-sector. Some of them are on the screen at the moment. And our brilliant consultants like Tom have worked in financial services, education, charities, retail, all sorts of different sectors, and really excited to see how that knowledge comes together in terms of getting the most out of your Gen AI practice today. So I think that's all everyone needs to know before we get going. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Tom, to get us started. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sophie. Cool. Right, let's go to the first slides. So of course, we're here today to talk about generative AI and some important and some ideas for kind of practical use cases as to how we might use that. So I'm sure everyone in this day and age, you have to be living under a rock to not know or have come across or heard the hype around Gen AI at the moment. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the term AI itself. I mean, AI is not new. It's been around for a number of years. We've been using AI methodologies in analytics and data science for a number of years. And, many in a lot of successful use cases. But what I want to do is explain what I want, what we see as the difference between generative AI and what I'm going to term traditional AI, so things like machine learning. And so I think about it a little bit. If we think about an analogy to the human brain, the left-hand side of the human brain is associated usually with the analytical, factual, the deterministic, the logical side of the brain that thinks about doing various things and handling things in a logical and deterministic way. And this is the analogy I put towards what traditional AI or machine learning things, solutions more closely associated with data science projects, regression, classification algorithms. I think maybe people might be familiar with those. But then on the right-hand side of the human brain, which is more closely associated with being creative and artistic, and it's where the imagination is kind of fueled from. It's very much a non-deterministic side of the brain, and that's where I see generative AI, this new kind of new discipline that's emerging or has been emerging over the last 18 months or so into the market sitting. So that's kind of how we think about it: generative AI versus traditional AI. Both are really important. Traditional AI is still very important and will remain very important in delivering business value. But as we move forward in the world, generative AI is certainly a new player in this space. And at Cynozure, we think generative AI is really a big deal. And so much of a big deal, in fact, that we think of it as what's called a flattening technology. So I'm not sure if anyone here is particularly familiar with that phrase or what it means. I'll go through it in a second. But if you want to go into a bit more detail and understand it, perhaps in a slightly better way than I'm about to explain it, there's a great article which I came across on Medium by a chap called Roger Martin, who goes through it and explains it in great detail and very clearly. But the essence of a flattening technology is something that comes along once every generational cycle. It's a technology that is so disruptive that it kind of leaves everything else behind it in its wake. And if we think about over the years across technology and just any form of new development, I go back to thinking about how the internal combustion engine, what the internal combustion engine did for transport by replacing horse and cart, and what the personal computer did in the 70s for kind of mainframe computing, and then the internet and email did for traditional communications in the 90s. These were flattening technologies, and what it means to be a flattening technology is for something to be for some leader to become so dominant in that space that it reaches above everyone else, and then you sort of get this behavior of other players crowding the market and scrabbling to catch up. And what it does is, by doing that, it establishes this new plateau. And the crucial thing about something being a flattening technology is that if a business or an organization fails to embrace it, they're destined to essentially become obsolete and will probably cease to exist. And that sounds a bit dramatic, but I guess if we think back to my examples of the internal combustion engine versus horse and cart, and the internet and the personal computer versus the mainframe. If you think about an organization today, if you were still relying on a mainframe computer, you wouldn't be running a very successful business. And if you were still relying on horse and cart, you probably wouldn't be running you wouldn't be particularly successful in the modern day. So that's what we mean by that. And I think we as a business believe that generative AI really is on that trajectory at the moment, and it will really become such an important part of businesses going forward that it's something that we should and need to embrace as we develop. And so at the moment, as I said, generative AI really is emerging into this crowded market. A number of important players here. OpenAI have captured everyone's attention and imagination with ChatGPT. They emerged onto the scene. I'm not saying they invented it, they didn't invent it, but they made popular and made the first kind of successfully commercially available popular version of what we are interacting with today as generative AI. And around them have crowded a number of other competitors. So Facebook / Meta, the Llama model that they've been developing is there. Google's Gemini model is ramping up. AWS have got their one called Bedrock, and of course Microsoft's Copilot, which is heavily linked and heavily joined to ChatGPT and OpenAI's models. And the one actually that isn't on there, which I probably should put, is Apple's play on this, which is called Apple Intelligence. For anyone that hasn't come across that, that's a very different style of use, in that it's going to be all on device privacy first. So we'll see how that plays out when they eventually launch it into the market. And all these tools have got ways in which you can interact with your generative AI model. I'm pretty sure everyone here has played with or experimented with ChatGPT or Copilot in their organization. But I guess crucially, and to the point of what we're talking about today around practical use cases, each one of these also have developer interfaces, APIs that you can use to invoke and call the models. And so that gives us this huge flexibility as to how we can embrace generative AI into our own business processes and use cases. And so at this point, I want to take a pause and think about why we're doing this. So I think the important thing about when we embark on this Gen AI journey, we have to consider two really important points. And this is something that's always very close to Cynosure's heart. The first one really is, what are your use cases, your value-adding use cases for the use of generative AI? Is Gen AI the right tool for the job? Are we just at risk of embracing it for embracing the hype? That's really important to understand. But also, do you crucially have the right technology infrastructure in place to support the use of Gen AI successfully in the business? And that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of the webinar. And so what I've done is I've come up with, I think, 3 fairly applicable, fairly broad range and use cases that hopefully will spark some creative ideas and resonate with yourselves in your businesses, and you might be able to see parallels with how we can create and how you might use these use cases or these solutions to add value. And so the first one I'll start off with is quite straightforward. I think the idea is pretty common amongst teams, is this idea of creating a chatbot. And so here, if we imagine ourselves in this world, as you can see with the image all generated with generative AI itself to give us these creative images. But here we've got this large language model robot, as it's depicted, looming large in a call center, customer service call center, over a crowd of seemingly very happy people, despite the fact they are presumably about to lose their jobs to this computer model. So with that being said, why would we want to do this? Why is a chatbot for a customer support service an important thing for a business? How can we add value? Well, probably the most obvious one here is that we can use this to reduce our operating costs. As I've said, the model could be used to not just necessarily replace, but slim down quite a large customer support team to save on business operating costs, which is again an important way of efficiency saving. The second one I've called out is that I think probably one that not everyone might think of here as being a benefit, but a chatbot powered by generative AI can be very good at providing a consistent sort of company voice, organizational voice, and that can be done in a number of ways. But probably most commonly, as we'll talk about in a second, as to the how, is this is something where because you can feed in data, you can provide custom data sets or bespoke data sets rather to the model to help it inform and answer questions more correctly and more in line with your business language and your business ethos. So it's an important thing, and that's something that actually could be quite challenging to do with a big team of humans, right? I mean, unless you've got a really tight script and they are adhering to sort of correctly adhering to language all the time, that's something that the human brain might slip up on and might find difficult to keep consistent. Whereas a robot, a generative AI model, is a lot easier to control in that sense. So how might we, as a company, do this? How might we, as a business, look at implementing a chat model, a chatbot? So there are 2 kind of main ones I want to call out. The first one here is around using the existing kind of infrastructure that some of these big cloud generative AI models provide. So things like ChatGPT have an implementation of the model called generative pre-trained transformers. They're called GPTs for short. It's in the name of the product, but also they have this store they've deployed now, which enables you to kind of take the model and customize it yourself, adding in various things like webhooks to call off to various various sources or various systems. You can provide it with source data that it can then use to supplement the model, and all this can be configured online with with kind of minimal coding knowledge required to get you started with your chatbot. And this is probably the first one that everyone has sort of experimented with, I guess, in this space, if it's something you're serious with. The second how we might do this is to look at doing this locally. This gives us considerably more control over the model that is deployed and how it's deployed, and crucially where it is deployed. But there are software tools. One of the most popular ones at the moment is called LangChain. It's a Python SDK for helping you pipeline and process and deploy local LLM models in a controlled environment. So this might be another option as well. Slightly code heavier, would require more development, but it's a second route to the solution. So that's why we would do it and how we might do this. But what are the kind of main watch outs that we should be aware of when implementing a chatbot solution in our business? And so the first one, I think, is a common concern that comes up all the time, known as LLM hallucination. I personally don't like the phrase hallucination. I think actually it's in this modern world of media, of a controlled or a very, very prevalent media across mainstream media and social media. It's very quick and easy for media articles to pick up on words that are perhaps slightly unfair. And in this case, hallucination was a word that was picked up by the mainstream media to describe AI models making mistakes, essentially going wrong or answering in a seemingly very confident way, but in the negative or in just incorrectly, right? It's I don't really like the word. It's, I think, a bit unfair. Everything and everyone can make mistakes, but it's something we should be aware of. And I think it introduces a new challenge in this solution because of that, and because we have to be aware that the model can sort of seemingly can hallucinate and give you weird responses. Slightly related, but also in the same vein, is that if the model is deployed ahead of being ready and being fully tested, and unless it is kind of it is gate kept very well and tightly controlled, you can also get the thing to be goaded into some sort of rude or potentially damaging responses. I won't mention the name of the company that did it, but there was a high-profile case over the summer, I think, where a large distributor deployed their first sort of generative AI powered chatbot, and it really did, and people quite quickly were able to goad it into saying how rubbish the company was and getting it to swear at them, etc. So again, something to watch out for. It's certainly it's certainly an area that is of concern or of note to be watched out on. The second one is around data governance and how the chatbot might control or might handle sensitive data. Now, this is linked to the two methods of how we might look at deploying and creating our solution. The local LLM version of deploying locally or having that tight control over the model you choose and where it's deployed can be a solution to this, right? And so if there is concern about sharing potentially sensitive data about the business, about it could be sensitive customer data, it could be sensitive IP, for example, or code, then that it may not be the correct choice to go with one of the more powerful cloud-based models like ChatGPT or Copilot or Meta's Llama. But you might find that a local deployment of that solution is the way to go, and it gives you similarly good performance, but you have that trade-off of it being kind of tightly controlled and secure. So those are kind of some watch outs, and I think that rounds off our first use case. The second one, we're kind of thinking about this in sort of slightly increasing complexity. This one is around using your generative AI model to increase the velocity of processes, streamline those processes, and in this case, I've chosen document summarization. So if you think about yourselves in a company like a law firm, or maybe in a healthcare firm like the NHS, where reams and reams of either digitally scanned PDFs are processed daily, or even physical files, physical paper copies themselves are processed, where someone or many humans have to kind of interact with those files to summarize and to process the information. How can we use generative AI or we can use generative AI here to speed that up and to make it more efficient? And I think it's probably, again, one of these areas that I think a lot of people here will have experimented with. I personally will attest to, I'm a big fan of using ChatGPT and Copilot to help me summarize documents and ideas and long reams of text into kind of more palatable bite-sized chunks. So yeah, there's definitely a streamlining of processing that can be done here with these formal documents, and also say efficiency savings as well. Why might we do this? If you can free up the time of valuable resources such as lawyers or doctors or junior doctors to do more work and to treat the patient's needs, then this is a great opportunity and a great use case for doing that. How might we do this? So I think this one, unlike our previous use case, where sure we can go to the online portal for ChatGPT, we can copy and paste some data into that portal, and we can get a summary of the output in a nice concise format. That's great. However, I think if you want to make this part of a pipeline, a regular processing of this data in a controlled way, then this is where we do have to lean into that aforementioned software development kit tool called LangChain or something similar, where we can implement it into our data platform as part of the processing, and have it as part of a pipeline. So we can take the data, we can use a tool to scrape information from the PDF that we've scanned. We can then pass that information into our large language model, and we can get the response back, and we can batch it up or not batch it up. Sorry, we can digest that into a unstructured data store or structured data store, a database, however you want to see it, and that can be used to help streamline our processes. In that process, of course, one of the most important aspects of working with generative AI models like this is knowing how to prompt it and to get the right question into it in the right way, so that you get the best and most effective response. This is probably the area that I've found personally has seen the biggest improvement in results, really, when it comes to working with the model. And I'm a big fan of two particular prompt engineering frameworks. One's called CoStar, the other is called Risen. I won't go into huge detail on them now, but these are, I just suggest you go and look up those acronyms for yourselves. There's plenty of really good information and resources on how they can be used. I'll talk to CoStar a little bit. So CoStar stands for, is an acronym for essentially subsections of a prompt, or that you can break down. So the C is the context. You give the context of what the question is, what you're asking the thing to do. The O is for objective. This is what you're asking for it to do. This is what it needs to solve. The S is for style, for the style in which it might return the response. T is for tone, the tone of language. It can be friendly, professional, can be formal, can be informal. The A is for audience, who is the intended recipient of this particular response. And then finally, the R is for response, and in what format and how you expect the response to be shared. Is it a long form of prose, or is it succinct bullet points limited to 10 or something like that, right? So I found that when you use that process, that framework, it really does help to structure your query in a more valuable way, I suppose. And then I've seen pretty much in all cases the best results out of my LLM query when using such a framework. So, okay, we've done all that. We've got our little pipeline in place now. What are our watch outs here? And the first one I want to call out is a familiar one for anyone who's worked on data platforming or data in general. That is data quality. Like with anything in any form of data quality has a huge impact on the performance of your LLM solution. It's just as important as it is with traditional ML and AI. You don't want to feed rubbish data into a classification model, for example, because it'll train and learn to classify things wrongly. It's the same, really the same difference with a generative AI model. Large language models in particular are particularly good at picking out spelling mistakes and missing words, for example. But if you feed the wrong type of data, or incorrect data, the wrong type of data into your model, or missing data altogether, for example, then you're going to get some pretty poor results, right? So I think data quality is really, really important. The second one I've called out is monitoring the performance of a model. And this is really important for any AI process, whether it be traditional ML or generative AI. And it's always important to monitor the performance to ensure that your generative AI model continues to provide the sort of high quality response that you're expecting of it. And to do that, we would recommend, or I would think about introducing something called the champion and challenger models. The champion challenger model methodology, where you have essentially a champion model, which is the top performer at the time, and then the challenger model is one that you would use your champion as the base, and then tweak that to get slightly bit higher performance, try some different iterations, some different optimizations on it, and then compare it quite carefully with your your champion. And if it's found to perform better, then it replaces the champion, it becomes the new champion, and then a new challenger steps into the fold. Sophie, just a quick question. Do you want me to answer questions as we go, or we're going to kind of collate them for the end?
Brilliant. I think we will collate them for the end, but one has just come in that's really relevant to this, which is, what are the top monitoring tools that you've used?
Yeah. So I think it's a very good question, and especially pertinent to kind of generative AI and this new kind of style of working with this technology. It's a good question. It's also a hard one to answer. I mean, what monitoring tools have I used? I don't think there are any particular monitoring tools that I would say are particularly well suited to generative AI. However, there are things that we can do to ensure that we monitor generative AI solutions effectively. So that's what the champion challenger model or framework is kind of about. But how might we do that? And so it's a really good question. In traditional AI and ML, it's quite easy to evaluate those models. So if you're looking at a classification model, for example, you might have things like, you can use metrics like the F1 score, or an ROC curve, or the precision and recall to get a numeric evaluation of the performance of your model. For regression, you can use something like the root mean squared error. You want to minimize that to get the better performance. It's kind of quite tricky to get sort of deterministic and numeric evaluation methods of generative AI performance, and that's kind of part of the reason why it's challenging, and that's why it's this kind of right hand side of the brain thinking about non-deterministic world, etc. So how I would do that, and how we've done this in the past with similar sort of use cases like to this, is to basically find, in this case, let's use our document summarization case. We'd find a small number of documents that we could use to that we know quite well the output, we know the contents, we know what it should summarize to, and we know the key points. We kind of heavily stack them. We kind of have them as control documents, for example, and we feed those into both for your champion and your challenger model. And then, and this is the case where you would need to have, this is where humans and human interaction is still very important when it comes to these sort of solutions. You would then use a human, someone who is versed with documents, who knows and also knows how the model is behaving, to kind of evaluate in the style of the response, and perhaps even then be able to kind of give it a numeric score based on how they feel the model has been evaluated. So I think it's a good question, but also a tough one to answer. I think there is no quick and easy way to saying that monitoring and evaluating these models is as easy as using this tool, right? I think it's still, at this point in time with generative AI particularly, there's still an intervention, an interaction required with a human to get the most out of it and to make sure you're getting the best performance from that tool. So I hope that kind of answered the question. I'll crack on with the rest of the presentation though. So my third and final use case here, say going up, increasing kind of complexity for each one. This one is around how we might improve the performance of an existing AI solution. And in this case, I've taken one that we've actually as a business, we've done this as a POC with one of our clients. And this is a scenario classification example. And so the area I'm going to use here, or the particular scenario client we work with here, was an insurer looking at who was insuring buildings, and you had descriptions of buildings, and you had to classify those into a certain buckets or a certain classification classifier based on a free text field. So that free text field could be filled with good information, bad information, spelling mistakes, etc. And so why might I want to do this? As we said for each one of these before, is again So this model for our client was working pretty well. They had a kind of an existing rules-based and traditional AI machine learning-based method in place already, and that was working pretty well for them. But there were some instances on the kind of like that top end of the performance you're trying to improve upon that were very hard to classify. So the example I give here is, let's say if we have a wooden building and the description says this is made from wood, then it's quite easy to classify with some rules that is a wooden building. If we take it a step further, slightly more difficult, it might say wooden planks or planks of wood or things like that in there. And that's where like a machine learning model, where as long as the examples are numerous, a traditional AI model can classify things, can learn to classify things like that based on familiar words in the comments. However, it becomes harder and harder as you get to kind of fringe and edge cases, and where the ML model will begin to fall over and not have enough data it's trained upon in a certain area to give you a particularly accurate or confident response. So I would use examples here where you might find some descriptions describe the wooden building as being made of pine or of oak, for example, and so the machine learning model might not know that oak is a type of wood or pine is a type of wood. However, generative AI models and large language models that have been trained on this vast knowledge of the internet as of a certain time ago will implicitly know that pine is a type of wood or oak is a type of wood. So this is a sort of scenario where we can use it to give it an edge over traditional machine learning. And so that's why I've sort of said here is we'd use essentially this generative AI solution to leverage that tiny increment, that final kind of few percentage points increase in performance, just to get the optimum performance out of what the solution we're trying to deliver. And so how might we do this? And I think, again, I would lean back and say this is definitely a more complicated custom approach. So you'd be looking to do this all in a pipeline in code and probably deploying things locally or integrating via the API to ChatGPT using their backend API service. But what I would also call out here is, and how we would do this, as I've already said, is around we'd integrate the generative AI model quite closely and tightly with the existing AI solution. And so it's not about replacing the whole thing with GenAI. It's about looking to GenAI to enhance and offer that final level of improvement. So we'd use only the GenAI on the hardest to classify scenarios where it's adding its most value. And so why might we do that? Why would we not just throw all of our classification, all of our scenarios at the GenAI model? And that first one here, and this is something that came out of our POC quite nicely, was this idea around cost. I think probably, I'm not sure how many people have paid for ChatGPT or have paid for some of the paid services, and the actual like monthly subscription cost of ChatGPT is about $25. I pay for it myself. That's not hugely expensive, but when you come down to using the API and sending in, like, you get charged by the token, the number of tokens, or it's not really the number of words, but the token essentially for a GenAI model is a subset, a sub part of a word. You break down words and phrases into tokens, so you're charged by the token. And so if you were and in this case, you might have to send quite a large prompt to the AI, which will include your list of classifications, the text string that you're looking for it to classify against. So if you're doing that en masse and in large volumes, then the costs can quite quickly skyrocket and spiral. So it's really important, I think, to have a good sharp eye on top of that, and to be able to kind of like optimize where you want to use your GenAI model to get the best out of it. And that's, that was the thing we proved as part of this POC, which is that it could be most effective at those kind of top like 3 or 4% of the really tough to classify scenarios. And my final watch out, I guess, applies really to all areas of generative AI, really, and it's around the fact that it's not, I don't think at any level should we consider it to be a silver bullet solution. We shouldn't be throwing, all like just using it to replace perhaps an existing solution in its entirety. There is still a lot to learn about these models. They are improving all the time at an alarming rate at the moment, but it still needs the right environment to perform, and it still needs the right expertise and knowledge to get the best out of it. And that kind of takes me on to my second of the 2 points of today's webinar, is around, is your data platform, have you got that platform in place ready to embrace generative AI successfully? And so I've kind of broken down here into three, what I think my kind of top three, my three core points around what I think are most important to generative AI working or having your platform infrastructure ready to support GenAI. The first one is around data management. I think it's incredibly crucial to have well managed data when you're dealing with generative AI and large language models. You need to know where your data is, know what the data describes, know effectively how it can be used and where it should be used effectively. If you don't know these things and you're just sort of clutching at straws and grabbing various things and hoping for the world coming out the end of your LLM model, then I think you're going to be sorely disappointed. Data management, as with all aspects of platforming and adding value from data, is a crucial first step to getting LLMs to work successfully for you. I'd also say as well that I'd highlight data governance as well inside that bracket. I think of data governance and data management as kind of one and the same. They're not strictly the same, but they kind of sit under that same umbrella term. And particularly for large language models, I think data governance is really important to make sure you have tied down and is particularly tight, especially if you're going to be feeding a lot of information about your business into said model. Large language models are very good at picking out things that humans may miss or may not read. If, for example, if you were to give it terms and conditions or reams and reams of code, for example, to try and understand how to make efficiencies, or how to understand where your holes might be in terms and conditions. So that can be used very positively by the LLM, but also it can in theory have access to information in there that people have missed. So if you have sensitive information hidden away in code and you're feeding it into a large language model that has access to the internet, you can in theory be in breach of some pretty tight rules there. So it's incredibly crucial to have tight governance around the data in your platform and know exactly what you're feeding your large language model. My second point of three is around data quality. I mentioned it already today in the talk, but I think I'm very passionate about that being an important part of the process. To say your model is only ever going to be as good as the data that you feed it. If you feed it rubbish data in, the response you get out is going to be similarly rubbish. So it's really important to have a good handle on your data quality. Make sure that you are feeding it the correct data and that you're not feeding it missing data or values that are mixed up or essentially different data types. It's really important to get on top of that to get the best out of the model. And the final one is AI operations. And so I think if people aren't familiar with this term, then think of AI operations doing for an AI solution what DevOps has done for software engineering. It's essentially a practical framework of steps to follow to get the best out of an AI solution in production and ensure that it continues to deliver value in production at pace. And so one of the examples I talk about when explaining why this is important is there was a problem which we termed the last mile problem at Cynozure, which refers to a 2019 statistic published in a kind of very high tier data conference where that year, I think anyone remembers back, data science was all the rage. It was the sexiest job in the world. I think around that time, everyone was scrabbling to employ data scientists to do machine learning, but only 10% of traditional machine learning AI solutions that were deployed in 2019 ever made it to a production deployment. So all that great work that data scientists were doing, all that great investment companies were bringing into data science, then only a very small number of those statistically ever became production services. And so there's a number of reasons why we think that barrier existed at the time. And the first one was, I think organizations sorely misunderstood the ever-evolving pace that these models, even traditional AI models, but similar to generative AI as well, the ever-evolving pace that they need to be monitored and reevaluated to remain relevant. The second one was around a lack of skills in being able to support the wider deployment of the solution. So data scientists are very intelligent people. They're great at building models and doing data analysis and all that good stuff, but they're not necessarily software engineers. And so when it comes to having to think about how you deploy your machine learning product, your traditional AI product, then that was a roadblock that was found there where those solutions weren't making it into a production deployment for that reason. And then the final one that I think probably the most crucial was around business confidence, especially at the executive level. Machine learning, traditional AI, as generative AI sits today, is a complex discipline. It has the ability to be quite confusing, and I think unless that we go on that journey of literacy and understanding with business executives, they're still going to become very cautious with deploying a technical solution, a super technical solution that they don't understand. And that was one of the main reasons for the last mile problem. They might have been very keen on embracing data science and seeing the value it could add, but when push came to shove and you had a model in front of you that was telling you to do certain things based on a clever black box data model, it was I'm not sure. Okay, no, thanks for this great work, but no thanks. I want to continue to rely on my gut thinking and reasoning and more traditional descriptive reporting approaches. So yeah, an important one to consider. And so I think having a good foundation of AI operations in place that's the final kind of cherry on the cake, the tip of the iceberg there, which will enable you to really gain and gather the best value from your generative AI solution. And with that, I want to close out my talk. Thank you so much for being very attentive and for listening and for the one question we've got so far. But Sophie, I think I'll hand over to you to talk a little bit to how we can help at Cynozure in supporting your generative AI needs.
Brilliant, thank you. And we will get time for the questions. I can see a few that have come in, so thank you for those. Keep them coming. We do usually get asked at this point how Cynozure can help. If any organisation is starting out on this path or is perhaps further along, we do have lots of ways of working with organisations, from something very, very bespoke to some really easy quick start frameworks that we can help organisations implement. Tom's got a lot of experience implementing a couple of these, but I really wanted to share our AI springboard on this session. So effectively, I think there's a QR code on here that people can scan if they want to find out more. So feel free. But this springboard, in a nutshell, is really set up around the fact that some organisations are still in a learning, discovering what's right for them phase. Others are getting themselves ready, and others are ready to act. So whatever point the organisation's at, we've got a framework that they can dip in and out of, and that we can help them to implement today to start delivering value from AI as quickly as possible. We will share details on this with you. If you'd like to see more info now, feel free to scan that QR code in. And if you do have questions on it, keep them coming in the Q&A chat. Perhaps if I pick a couple of those up, Tom, if you're comfortable.
Of course, yeah.
There's a really interesting one that's come in, and it goes back to the beginning of your conversation today when you were talking about traditional AI versus Gen AI, and how you would categorize lots of the words that we hear. So a couple of the examples that have come in have been around machine learning, predictive AI, deep learning, and whether you would say they were traditional or Gen AI.
Thanks. That's a really good question. The thing with AI, and I guess someone who's come from a data science background. I sort of trained at university the final years of my doctorate to doing to taking on and embracing machine learning, particularly methodologies, and I guess the broader AI context. So AI is a very broad umbrella term, and so at the base of it, tools like ChatGPT, large language model tools, can be thought of as machine learning models, right? Underneath, they are neural network models that are used and trained on a huge ream of data and have been optimized incredibly well to be what they are today. I guess the split in my mind between generative AI and traditional AI is where, if I draw this back to that kind of first slide when I talked about the human brain, is I think generative AI is incredibly powerful in that kind of non-deterministic, creative, imaginative space. It's very good at natural language processing, very good at kind of giving you ideas for things. You've seen all the crazy images in the slides were all drawn with AI completely from scratch. There's no basis of anything else. It's just drawing it from its knowledge of pictures on the internet and what you're telling it. So I think that is for me is the really important distinction between generative AI, it's that creative, non-deterministic side, and the more traditional what I call traditional deterministic AI, machine learning, things like classification models, regression models. Where does sort of deep learning and neural networks sit on that? Well, I mean, there is obviously it's not a black and white boundary. Maybe the left and right side of the brain is not the best analogy, but I like that analogy. But I think there is definitely a blurred line between the disciplines. Like some of those machine learning models are what generative AI models are based on and founded on. So there is a crossover, right? But I think the key one is around, think about it as answers you can get, deterministic answers that you can get versus non-deterministic, and creativity versus factual and analytical, that sort of thing. Hope that answers the question in some way.
Brilliant, thank you. In terms of some of the use cases that you've talked about today, the first one around creating a chatbot, can you talk a little bit about how a chatbot might handle agency?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just for clarity, what I mean by agency here is it's the autonomy for the chatbot to be able to interact with, take what you're talking to it about and then interact with an external system to get something done. So, I mean, you may have come across in the last year or so, there was a couple of these sort of generative AI consumer products that were released or launched / introduced at CES this year in January. One of them was called the Rabbit R1. It's a little device about this big, which had a GenAI model. It was based on a GenAI model, and the idea was that you could ask it to do things like order pizza or order an Uber and all that. And so the agency part of that little insistence would be the taking your response, what you've asked it, and then making a request to Uber or to the pizza or to Domino's Pizza, for example, to order your pizza. So that's what we mean there. And how would I think of GenAI handling this? I think at the moment it's definitely somewhat of a complex ask. In this case, let's think of our customer service example, and you might have the customer asking to make a particular change to their customer account, for example, or want to look up an order and update an address field. Now, these are things I think that you might have experienced, or we've all experienced, some of these poor assistants you get at the moment that are very heavily based on just speech to text and then rules-based models. But I think with generative AI being where it is at the moment, I think there still needs to be an element of a hybrid approach here, where you would use the LLM, the model, the chatbot to triage and to gather the information, do all the hard work, make it do the legwork, and then what I would then do is use that to then triage off those requests to a human being. I mean, this is probably not the sexiest answer we could give here, and there's no reason why as part of your chatbot you could not look to integrate some form of agency, give it the ability to make calls to an API, for example, or to interact with the source system. However, you just have to be very careful around that, especially around that LLM hallucination, that LLM infallibility we talked about earlier on, that it is giving you the right answer, especially in those sort of sensitive scenarios. But I think a lot of what generative AI can handle, and one of the most powerful things it can do at the moment is to do a lot of that legwork. I like to think of the words AI, or sorry, not words, the acronym AI as standing for advanced intern. I don't want to belittle interns too much, but I think think about an intern is someone who's very keen, comes in fresh faced, is able to do a lot of kind of like small, sometimes very complicated tasks, but very quickly and efficiently, and they just want to get things done. That's how I think of how you can embrace the use of generative AI, right? You can use it, you can feed it, so you can ask it like bigger questions and ask it to do things that might take you a few hours to do, which it can do and chunk through in a few minutes, those sort of things, that sort of area. So I've segued a little bit on that front, but I think in this point, my kind of too long don't read is I look to kind of make some form of hybrid approach to how it can handle agency, get it to do that hard work for you, but then also triage it with a human being interaction.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've got time for one more. I think this is going back to where you were talking about champion and challenger models earlier.
Yeah.
Are you able to talk about how you'd evaluate their performance and when and how the challenger might replace the champion?
Yeah, sure. Again, this is so the idea or the concept of the champion challenger model is not particularly new. It's been used. It's kind of if anyone's kind of familiar with like machine learning operations, it's definitely part of that process there. With this idea of having a best-in-class solution that needs to constantly evolve, and so you're constantly comparing your champion to a challenger, or you're constantly challenging that model with something new. Um, as I said earlier, in the case of generative AI and traditional AI, evaluating the performance of a machine learning model, a regression model, a classification model is normally quite straightforward because you can use it's deterministic. You can evaluate its performance numerically by looking at certain metrics, etc., etc. GenAI is slightly different in the sense that it's very hard to kind of deterministically measure the performance and evaluate the performance of the model between different model responses. Typically, as well, if you feed the same prompt into a generative AI chatbot or a model, the same prompt twice, you won't get the same answer back because of how they work. So I think to what I said earlier on about this, the main ways or the best way of evaluating this would be to kind of to set up like a controlled experiment, would be to give your champion and challenger model the same 5 texts and the same prompt for each. Well, no, maybe not the same prompt. If the prompt is what you're tweaking to improve it, maybe not. But give them the same 5 to 10 texts, depending on how many you deem necessary to get a good evaluation metric. And you should know those texts pretty well. You should know like what you want to see in a summary, what you want to see in like a short summary, a long summary. If it's got recommendations in it, you should know what the recommendations are that the thing needs to pull out when prompted. And so you have those kind of like controlled variables, and you have maybe kind of come up with some sort of capability scoring matrix against each of the asks that you're giving it. And then what I would do is then feed all of those documents into the models, champion and challenger, and then from the outputs, this is where again the human interaction is incredibly important when it comes to generative AI, and evaluating their performance. I would use a human being to go through and make a judgment on the level of the response getting, and that could be based on a number of rules. You could maybe I certainly suggest a number of human beings doing this, so you're not just relying on one person. So you can then from that kind of create a deterministic a scoring metric for the model. So you might have 5 people who are evaluating the responses to the 5 control samples, each of them following their own set of guidance on how to score it, but using their own judgment as to how well it's performing. And so that way, if you do that enough times, then you can get a numeric response and a numeric evaluation of the model to see which one is performing better. I mean, that does sound, and it is that is a slightly more long-winded process to just comparing the performance metric of a classical model, but I think that's something that we need to think about and be aware of when it comes to dealing with generative AI. It's not at the moment anyway. There isn't really, I think, at the moment a particularly good way of evaluating that model sort of in an automated way without human interaction.
Brilliant. That's super helpful. Thank you, Tom. I think that's the end of the questions that we've had for today. So thank you so much for your expertise, Tom. Been brilliant listening. Hope it's been useful for everyone joining. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us today. If you would like to ask any more questions, or if there's any way that we can help you on your AI journey, let us know. You can talk to the team or visit us at cynozure.com and get in touch with us that way. This session has been recorded, and we will aim to make that available for participants and any of your colleagues that you'd like to share with in the next few working days. So do keep an eye out for that. But just to say thank you again, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. We've got a few more coming up in November on the topics of data culture, platforming, and various other subjects. So keep an eye out for those. We'd love to see you on those too. But have a great evening. Thanks for joining, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you all. Thank you.